Imagine being pregnant at only 13 years old and carrying the future King of England in your womb. How would you feel? Excited? Happy? Perhaps scared? Well, that's exactly what happened to Lady Margaret Beaufort in 1483 when she became pregnant at just the age of 13. But why was she married to an older man? And what did her life look like after giving birth to England's future king? Keep watching to find out. Welcome back, everyone. Today we'll be taking a look at the sad life of Lady Margaret Beaufort, who got pregnant at the age of 13 and gave birth to England's future king. So make sure to watch the video till the end to find out more about her life story. But before we begin, be sure to subscribe for more such amazing videos. That said, let's begin. Margaret Beaufort was born in 1441 to Edmund Tudor, the first Earl of Richmond, and his wife, Lady Jasper. At the time of her birth, Margaret's father, Edmund, was in his early 20s, while her mother was only 17. However, Margaret's parents died when she was only 2 years old, leaving her as the sole heir to her father's title. According to records, her father died from wounds sustained in battle, while her mother's cause of death remains unknown. As a result, Margaret had to live with her grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who raised her until she turned 13. Growing up, Margaret didn't have it easy. She suffered from several health issues, including scoliosis and a heart condition. In fact, doctors initially believed that her abnormal curvature of the spine was the reason behind her heart ailment. However, further studies later revealed that the two conditions were not related. When Margaret was 12, her guardian, the Bishop of Winchester, arranged for her to marry Sir John de la Pole, the second son of the Duke of Suffolk. This was a strategic move as it would help strengthen ties between the families. However, Margaret's wedding to John took place when she was only 13 years old, and he was nearly twice her age. The marriage ceremony was performed by none other than Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who was also her distant cousin. What's even more shocking is that Margaret and John had sexual intercourse, despite her young age. As a result, Margaret soon found herself pregnant. Although there were rumors that King Edward IV was the father of Margaret's child, this has never been proven. Most historians believe that the child was most likely John's, since DNA testing conducted on his remains showed that he carried the Y chromosome of King Edward IV. This means that John was the legitimate heir to the throne, as he descended directly from King Edward III. As news of Margaret's pregnancy spread, people started speculating about who the father really was. Some claimed that King Edward IV had an affair with Margaret, while others insisted that Sir John de la Pole was the real father. The controversy surrounding the child's paternity reached such a fever pitch that King Edward IV ordered a series of tests to determine the truth. However, these tests proved inconclusive, leaving everyone to draw their own conclusions. In the end, it didn't matter who the father was, as Margaret was already married to Sir John, and the child she was carrying was seen as a legitimate heir to the throne. Moreover, the legitimacy of the child was further solidified when it was born a few months later and was named Henry Tudor. Shortly after Henry's birth, his mother, Margaret, left him in the care of her grandmother and went to France for an arranged marriage with a French nobleman named Jean de Valois. It seemed like Margaret had finally escaped the clutches of her abusive husband, but unfortunately, this was not the case. Despite being only 14 years old, Margaret was expected to consummate the marriage. However, she refused to do so, citing her previous marriage as the reason. To make matters worse, John returned from France and joined Margaret in her new husband's castle, where he proceeded to beat her up. Fearing for her safety, Margaret fled to the protection of her grandmother, who took her back to England. Although Margaret had managed to escape her abusive spouse, she was still legally married to him. Eventually, her grandmother helped her secure an annulment on the grounds that John had forced her into sexual intercourse when she was only 13. Following the annulment, Margaret and John went their separate ways. Not long after, Margaret caught the eye of Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who was a distant cousin of hers. They began dating, and eventually Margaret fell pregnant again. Once again, the rumors started swirling around town. People were curious to know who the father of Margaret's second child was, especially since she had been previously married to the man who had fathered her first child. However, it didn't take long for Margaret to set the record straight. She made it clear that Henry was the father of her unborn child and proudly announced that they were planning to marry soon. True enough, the couple tied the knot in a small ceremony attended by only a handful of guests. But their happiness was short-lived, as Henry passed away a few months later due to complications from tuberculosis. Margaret was devastated by the loss of her husband, but she knew that she had to move on for the sake of their child. After all, she was now a single mother to 2 young boys, and she needed to be strong for them. To make matters worse, Margaret's brother suddenly passed away, which meant that she was now the head of the Tudor family. Despite the challenges she faced, Margaret was determined to raise her sons as well as possible. She took on the responsibility of educating them and ensuring that they had the best opportunities in life. As her sons grew older, Margaret started looking for suitable matches for them. She wanted to secure their futures by marrying them off to women of noble birth. However, she had to be careful to choose partners who would not only be socially acceptable, but also treat her sons well. Meanwhile, Margaret's eldest son, Henry, was making a name for himself as a skilled warrior. He had accompanied his uncle, King Henry VII, on military campaigns and had distinguished himself as a brave and intelligent fighter. This made Margaret proud, but she also worried about the dangers of war. As the years went by, Margaret's sons reached the age of maturity, and she began to think about their future. She wanted them to have a comfortable life, but she also knew that they had to earn their keep, so she encouraged them to pursue careers in politics or the military. For example, she pushed her eldest son, Henry, to seek higher office and greater recognition. At the same time, she made sure that her youngest son, Edmund, received a good education, so that he could one day take over her role as head of the Tudor family. Despite her efforts to shield her children from the harsh realities of life, they were not always successful. Sometimes Margaret's sons would get into trouble because of their reckless behavior. When this happened, Margaret would be disappointed, but also determined to make things right. She would use her influence and resources to get her sons out of any jam they might have gotten themselves into. However, she also made sure to teach them valuable lessons, so that they wouldn't repeat their mistakes. One of the most important lessons she wanted to instill in them was the importance of humility. Margaret knew that they were privileged individuals, and she didn't want them to forget that. She taught them to be grateful for what they had and to treat others with kindness and respect. Looking back on her life, Margaret realized that she had been through a lot. From a young age, she had to deal with the loss of her parents and the burden of being the sole heir to her father's title. She had a difficult first marriage and had to fight for her freedom from an abusive husband. Despite all this, she never lost sight of her values and principles. She remained a devout Christian and a loyal friend and sister. As Margaret grew older, she started to think about her legacy. She knew that she had accomplished a lot in her life, but she wanted to do more. She wanted to be remembered as someone who had made a positive impact on the world. So she began to focus on charitable works, helping the poor and sick and supporting those in need. One of the ways she did this was by donating money to build schools and hospitals. She also established a scholarship fund to help poor students get an education. Margaret was also a patron of the arts, and she used her wealth to support musicians, painters, and writers. She hosted concerts and exhibitions in her home, and she commissioned works from some of the most talented artists of her time. As the years went by, Margaret's health started to decline. She suffered from arthritis and other ailments that made it difficult for her to move around. But she never complained, and she continued to serve her community until her death. When Margaret passed away in 1509, she left behind a legacy of kindness and generosity. She was remembered as a true Renaissance woman who had excelled in every aspect of life. Her sons, Henry and Edmund, carried on her legacy and continued to support charitable causes. Henry, who became King Henry VIII, was known for his lavish spending on the arts and his patronage of famous writers like William Shakespeare. Edmund, on the other hand, became a prominent statesman and helped to shape England's foreign policy during the reign of his half-brother, King Henry VIII. Despite the controversies surrounding their family, Margaret's sons went on to become successful and influential figures in English history. Margaret Beaufort may have been born into privilege, but she used her status to help others and make a lasting impact on the world. Her story is a reminder that no matter where you come from, you can always choose to be kind and generous.